If you open your Instagram feed or glance at the latest issue of National Geographic, you might notice that mushrooms are having a moment. Mushroom enthusiasts, yes, they do exist, say that for too long, habitat managers, conservationists, and even farmers haven't paid nearly enough attention to the existence of fungi or its potential. And if you're just a deer hunter who doesn't have time for foraging or food plots, well, you're going to want to listen up too. I'm executive editor Natalie Krebs, and today on the podcast, I'm talking to Matt Williams. Matt is a lot of things. He's an ag kid, a retired whitewater rafting guide, and a former pork and poultry farmer. He's currently a deer hunter in Michigan's UP, a citizen scientist, and, as he puts it, a self-taught mycologist. That's someone who studies mushrooms. In other words, he's the biggest hunter turned mushroom nerd you will ever meet. A few years ago, Matt was growing all kinds of fancy mushrooms for farmers markets and upscale restaurants. He noticed that a particular variety, called Stropharia, or the wine cap mushroom, was just getting hammered by local whitetails. And that's when it all clicked. Now, Matt makes a living helping hunters grow mushroom food plots. In this episode, we'll cover how easy it is to make one, why it's not too late to start one this season, and why even casual deer hunters should pay more attention to mushrooms. So, Matt, I want to start with how you figured out that mushroom food plots could be a thing. You were farming mushrooms commercially, and you got really fed up, as farmers do, with a bunch of deer eating your crop. So tell us about that. Tell us about your epiphany.
So in the guide world, there's a saying, embrace the suck. You turn the weaknesses that are in front of you into a strength. And so while I was kind of just figuring out the existential crisis of all this, I turned to my playbook and embrace the suck. Okay, well, how do we do that? And then it really hit me. Well, there's certified alfalfa on this farm. There's silage corn. The neighbors have food plots. Why are the deer in these pines tearing apart my mushrooms when everybody and their mother spending thousands of dollars all around me for whitetails? And that's when it really began to hit me like, okay, there's something to this. The literature supports this. It goes back a long way, and this could be a thing. And so I reached out to Jared at the Habitat podcast, and he's the first one to kind of say, you know what, I'm intrigued. Let's talk about this. And that's been a couple of years ago now, and it's been a fun ride ever since.
Yeah. So what year would this have been that you figured this out?
Well, it really began to click about 2018 or so. And then after the pandemic in 2022, I reached out to Jared, and it just kind of became a recurring nightmare of sorts. And the more time went on, the more my mind was convinced that, like, you know, there's something significant to this, and I probably ought to share it with folks.
Yeah. This all seems relatively new. Like, who all is planting mushroom food plots? You were the first person, apart from Kip Adams over at National Deer Association, who we've talked to, because you sent him mushrooms. Like, I don't know anybody else who is planting mushrooms with the goal of feeding deer and hunting those plots. So what kind of awareness have you noticed in the hunting community around this, if at all?
Well, prior to me, I can't say that there was anyone that I know of. And if there was, yeah, they were geniuses too, in my opinion.
Silent geniuses.
All that joking aside. I don't think that anybody was prior to me starting to talk to folks about this. And since then, I knew that I could never get the groundswell I needed by going after the common guy. I kind of tried a little bit on Facebook, and that was rough. The internet is the Thunderdome, you know?
People just like didn't buy it, or what was the?
Oh no, you're full of crap. There's no way. Blah blah blah. Yeah, I mean, just everything you can imagine. Very humbling experience. I don't want to revisit the pain. Long story short, I stepped back and I was like, "There's no way this is ever going to work from that angle. I've got to go to the guys at the top, the people at the top who will give this an honest shot from a perspective of a habitat manager, from the perspective as an academic. Those folks are going to be the ones who vet this in the end either way. And so why don't I just go straight to them And so that became a new humbling experience and getting hung up on, laughed at, and ignored. But there were some folks who were really nice and welcoming, and they began to play with it. Folks like Kip Adams, who said, you know what, the deer do eat mushrooms, and I would sure like to see what happens here. Bronson and Steve Damaris agreed to put it in down at the MSU's deer lab. Dr. Kroll put it in at his research facility. And those guys were kind of late getting to the party last year whenever I was on the Prove It tour. But Dr. Brucker and John Teeter saw exactly what I saw. They got pounded.
Let's go back a little bit to your operation that you have. Tell us where you are, kind of the size of it, and what mushrooms you're growing. And then what's most interesting to me is how specifically were the deer targeting your mushrooms? Like, were they browsing, gulping them down in one bite? Like, walk me through what was happening on your farm.
So I farmed a bunch of different stuff. I started off with organic produce, cut flowers, herbs, pastured poultry, pastured pork, and I transitioned eventually exclusively to fungi. And through that transition to fungi, I offered a very wide array of fungi, both farmed and forage. And I grew fungi indoors and outdoors as well. So basically, I grew everything I could get my hands on as far as different cultivars and species went that was in the gourmet and exotic world. And I had a pretty nice sized log yard, few acres, several thousand shiitake logs, and we were doing good. The pandemic hurt us pretty bad, and that ultimately led to me taking a different job and closing the farm, or more really just scaling it back to a smaller presence, so I didn't have to drive as far. But throughout all of this, we started off with Stropharia or wine cap mushrooms as a part of what we offered. And because they're so easy to produce on cheap waste resources, we continually try to scale them up because customers liked them, we liked them, but also wildlife liked them. So initially we tried to use them as a trap crop. And what I mean by that is farmers will use one crop to attract pests and predators to that crop to preserve the integrity of the other crops. And this is things like if you put eggplants out in your potato patch, potato beetles will go to those eggplants and they'll start there, and you can kind of use them to trap that pest infestation. So we use the same thing or same approach with regards to wine cap or Stropharia in deer. And it didn't work as well as I'd intended because it brought more deer in whenever I got bigger, which was the opposite of what I wanted. I wanted to feed the deer that were already there, kind of be good neighbors with them, and have plenty for ourselves and have it not be an issue. And the larger and larger we went with it, the more that it became an issue. Luckily, there weren't a whole lot of other mushrooms that they really tore up like this. There were only maybe one or two others, and they're very expensive and difficult to grow, and they're much harder, and they're a little more laborious affair, and they're really only a one time of the year thing. Stropharia, wine cap by comparison, happens many, many times throughout the years for many, many years. And so when I was embracing the suck, I was like, well, holy crud, this is a perennial thing that you could do and I enjoy hunting. I'm not your prototypical hunter where my dad, my grandpa, and everybody, had a hunting camp, or my dad kind of poked fun at me for hunting and said it was for rednecks. Go to the store and buy me. Yeah, I used to read Outdoor Life by checking it out at the library, and I would read like an entire year in a weekend. So I taught myself to hunt. I'm a meat forager. I forage for a lot of foods. I grow a lot of foods. I'm a poor man that's a foodie. And so to be a foodie as a poor guy, you've got to be extremely charming, or you've got to make your own food. And so I made my own food, and I grew those wonderful ingredients that you can only see on the Food Channel or in exotic, shows or magazines or in the inner cities to get access to. And here in rural America, where I live, the Michigan's Upper Peninsula border with northeastern Wisconsin. Our farm was on the Wisconsin side, literally on the riverbank. And now we've moved into Iron Mountain, Michigan, just across the river from Aurora, Wisconsin, where we were. Long story short, it just kind of happened. And then I had to go back and find the science to support it, because at first I thought I was just crazy. Somebody maybe was stealing them, or, where are they all going?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So tell me, what does the science say? What kind of nutritional value is in mushrooms? And is there much documentation of wild deer eating mushrooms?
The first recorded instance of a deer consuming a mushroom was in 1820 with Elliot von Eschenbach. He saw this and coined the term mycophagy, which is still used today as the descriptive terminology for anything eating a mushroom. And he named the mushroom deer fungus or Elaphomyces, which, as it turns out, is a staple of all mammalian mycophagous diets and exists throughout the world and is actually a critical part of our planet's funga, which is the third part of the saying flora, fauna. Well, now it's flora, fauna, funga. If you look at the new National Geographic, there's a big push to preserve fungi because everything on this earth depends on them. All bacteria, all plants, all animals depend on fungi. As we learned in our elementary education, life begins and ends at rot. And rot is, in fact, fungi.
Sure. And so one thing that I have not seen a deer eat a mushroom, and I've watched a lot of deer eat a lot of browse in the woods. And I think most hunters I've talked to haven't really seen it that much. So tell me a little bit more about the literature, but also tell me what clues can you look for if you're not actually seeing the act of a deer eating a mushroom? What clues in the area on the ground in the woods are you looking for?
If you're not within 10 feet, you're probably not even going to notice that they're doing it if you are watching them, right? The majority of the mushrooms that they're going to eat are terrestrial, meaning they grow on the ground. Well, he's got his head down near an oak tree. He must be eating acorns. No, not necessarily at all. Matter of fact, there's a lot of mushrooms near oak trees. They're one of the primary hosts of the mushrooms we covet. When we're looking for this, what we're looking for is maybe pieces of the stems and the caps because they're a little bit of a sloppy eater and they don't really eat the stem. They pretty much are going to eat only the cap, and they will seek them before they pop out from the litter. So you won't even know that the mushrooms are there, and they could eat them all overnight, very quickly. There's a video that an outdoor writer here in this area named Richard P. Smith, who's done, I believe, some writings for you guys, has done, and he walks with deer. So he walks literally through the forest with them, bucks, does, mature, young, the whole herd, right? And has done so for many years.
I didn't really realize how much deer ate mushrooms until I started walking with them.
This is Richard P. Smith. He's giving an interview and a YouTube video that contains footage of deer just going to town on wild mushrooms.
There's a group of deer I started walking with. They learned to trust me. I could go with them wherever they went and watch what they did. And actually, you have to be right with the deer to see them eating mushrooms. They eat a lot of them when they're first emerging from the ground. They eat a variety of mushrooms. I'm not good at identifying mushrooms, but I've seen them eat red ones, yellow ones, green ones, white ones, brown ones, all different kinds of mushrooms. I was amazed at the variety of mushrooms and fungus that deer eat.
He is an amazing source of photographic evidence. Beyond that, you like I said, you probably have seen it. You just didn't realize what you were looking at. And when it comes to the evidence on the ground, there may not be any. I mean, it's obscenely hard to find it. You may be foraging like I do and encounter mushrooms with a bite missing out or a piece of a broken stem over here and think perhaps my rival humans have already foraged here, when in fact it's wildlife. Mariah Bogus, who is with University of Mississippi and, of course, does all kinds of wonderful stuff. He has a big trail cam sequence of a buck just tearing apart a whole patch of chanterelles over the course of several hours. And it's just one of those things where we pride ourselves as hunters as thinking we know everything about our deer world, when I think we've glossed over this, guys, and it's time to take a look. The 1820s with, Ness von Eschenbach is just the beginning of it. By the the late 1800s, Cook, who is kind of one of the people who was around with the Aldo Leopold days and was a brain trust member of his crowd, put a call to investigate fungi as a feed resource. And he coined the term vegetable meat in description of them. Of course, at this time, fungi were still considered part of the plant kingdom, so they weren't separated into their own kingdom later. Butler in the 1919 with Parks, and then again in 1922. And we get into the 40s and the 60s, and these are all the people that have godfathered the people we look up to now. And there was a huge push up until 1969 to explore them much further. But the Controlled Substances Act came out in 1970, and that made mushrooms a big faux pas in our society and really set it all back. And so there has been a huge push in Habitat to explore this before, and there's been a lot of discussion. It's been kind of left to the wayside because many habitat managers and other folks are just not mycologists. And not that I'm, some big time mycologist. I'm self-taught. So I consider myself an applied mycologist at best. I know a lot about a little and a little about a lot, but I've had the privilege of going deeper, I think, than any other human being ever has into the subject. And the more you turn over rocks, the more that there is. It's just been glossed over and maybe even a bit demonized. And now fungi are having, we're having our moment.
One thing you just hit on, I wonder if it's been so easy for us to gloss over mushrooms, in part because they're so transitory and responsive to environmental conditions. And also one thing that we've talked about before, which is that they're water soluble. They're so digestible that when rumen studies have been done on deer, when we look at, what are deer eating? Often we don't see mushrooms reflected in it because they pass through the digestive system so easy. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's somewhat accurate. There are a lot of rumen studies and esophageal content studies that do show them. And there are studies that link them to additional body mass and gaining weight faster when consumed in the diets as well. So, yeah, that's mostly accurate.
Tell me about the nutritional content of mushrooms. Protein, carbs, what are we looking at?
All right. Let's start with protein because everyone's interested in that. We're about 25% protein. It can be more, it can be less, depending on the substrates involved and the type of materials roughly that we're making it out of. There's good water-soluble protein there, and there's also carbs, but there's also a full complement of all 9 aminos, plus bonus aminos that are found in nothing else. There's water-soluble fats, our ergosterol, which is the precursor to vitamin D. And if you're trying to grow antlers or you're lactating, you really need a lot of vitamin D. And deer can't get vitamin D from any other resource in their diet. It doesn't exist. In addition to that, there's another novel compound of interest, which is ergothioneine. Ergothioneine is a big health food craze right now, mostly for humans and kind of the free radical and, rejuvenation of your body. Well, it's also found in deer's antler blood during their growth of the antlers in the velvet stage, but it's not found in the body. And it's been specifically tested in multiple species of deer and been noticeably found, and at high levels, no less. So this is one of the few foods that we can directly correlate with the chemical smoking weapon to antler growth. And when we look at the mineral load on it, that phosphorus and calcium ratio, which is important, of 2-to-1, is present there at that ratio. And it's once again water-soluble calcium and phosphorus. There's a huge difference between various sources of calcium and phosphorus and things of that nature. The magnesium, the zinc, there's selenium 600 times higher in mushrooms than any other known food source. It's the copper, you name it. You go right down the list. There's thousands upon thousands of studies that exist on this mushroom.
When we're talking like in this episode, we're specifically talking about the mushroom species that you sell for deer are the Stropharia mushrooms.
Yep. Stropharia rugosa annulata would be the Latin, which means king's crown, which the annulus or the veil on the other underside, the ring that's remaining, it's called the annulus. It looks like a crown, like a king would wear. Okay. With little squares on it. And that's where that name comes from. But the king's crown mushroom, or 8,300 names, compost giant, the garden mushroom, there are a lot. Wine cap is the most common, but Stropharia rugosa annulata, or SRA, yep, same mushroom. We've not talked about any other mushroom during this podcast yet.
We'll be right back after the break. For the people who are listening to this and they want to make a mushroom food plot, they're interested, but they don't know what kind of areas should they be looking for? About how much space do they need? Kind of what time of year are they thinking about?
With the last few years, the weather patterns have been, let's say, not normal. And when we get rain, it tends to sheet or run off of the landscape. So I encourage as many people as possible to place this somewhere where during that runoff, the water slows and pools. Because when we do that, when we place it there, the mushroom food plot becomes a giant sponge. And as it matures, it absorbs thousands of times more water than it could previous when it was fresh materials that the fungi had not colonized and began to consume and decompose. And so when it does rain, we absorb much more water, and there's a fair amount of water in every plant, et cetera. Well, fungi have like 10% more water than plants. And so water equates to more fruits. And the fruits or the mushrooms that we think of are what we're after, and the deer are after too. And they're going to eat the tops of them in particular, and those big, fat, juicy tops that kind of like closed in the button stage, similar to what we would see with regards to how the grocery store mushrooms are packaged. They're not picked when the tops are open completely. They're picked when the tops are closed. And deer really have snooty standards when it comes to mushrooms. And they really love them when they're in that young button stage or primordia formation. Luckily for us, these mushrooms can be a pound or more still in that button stage. Some of them have been recorded as much as 5+ pounds, the size of a dinner plate, with a stem the size of a Nalgene bottle. And that's one mushroom on 1 square foot. If you want to build soil, you embrace the fungi. And that's what happens when we build the mushroom food plot as a byproduct, is you get this beautiful high carbon fungal rich soil that's pH neutral, because Basidiomyces, or white rot fungi, adjust the pH of the soil. So we can grow this under pines where nothing else can be grown, and it proliferates very well in that shade and moisture rich environment. And it's per acre, if we really want to do a comparison, we can produce a substantial amount more food with fungi than we can with any known agricultural crop or plants or forbs or acorns or anything. There's and then it's not a versus thing. These fungi uplift and support the rest of the ration of the diet. That's why we use chitinase or chitin as an addition to cattle feed. And then also in other feeds as a soy alternative, because of aminos like lysine that are represented in fungi and other chitin sources. And so mushrooms are a water-soluble form of chitin that's more easily digested by ruminants faster. So it's kind of like this amazing thing that on many different levels is doing great stuff for us as habitat managers. And it's not just for deer. It's elk and mule deer and caribou and moose and all the other ungulates especially, but bison, bighorn, and moving further down the list, it's every squirrel and turkey and quail and rabbit, and they'll come through and pick apart the stems for the bugs. It's this is an integral part of our ecosystem. So the way I've done it is, there's a million ways to make these. There's as many as there is people telling you how to do it, right? And of which there are a lot. And I don't think many of these people have actually done it for a living. Long story short, I've tried it 100 different ways. And the way I tell you to do it is relatively very simple. We take our 5x10, let's say that's a 5-pound package, it's $26 plus shipping, right? And we take that pool table size area and we rake the ground clean. We need the bacteria and the fungi to work with us, and they will. We just have to expose them. And we take our spawn and we kind of crumble it up until it's sawdust again, or looks like sawdust, marble size or ping pong or smaller and mostly finer. And we cut open that bag and we sprinkle 25% of that bag on that 5x10 area. And then we take a soaked straw bale, meaning we take a bale of straw and we throw it in a trash can, and we flood that trash can with a brick on top or something to hold it down, or a strap around it, or in a stock tank or in a bucket of tractor, and dip it in the creek, whatever you can do. But the soak is important, because then that straw is nice and hydrated. And then when we make it, it has like a wet, hydrated core, and then we're covering it with wood mulch. It tends to be almost drought proof at that point. It's very much sit and forget. So anyway, we take our bale of straw, cut the strings, we take half of it and we lay it out like we're doing the bottom of a horse stall. And then we take another 25% of our spawn and we sprinkle it over it like we're a Robert Downey Jr. meme. And then we take the rest of our bale of straw, put it over top of that, and then put the rest of the spawn on it, cover it all with wood chips. If possible, walk or drive on it to kind of collapse the air pockets and walk away. Pray to God that it rains a lot.
And if it doesn't rain a lot, can you go back out there with a sprayer or buckets? Or
well, you would want to maybe do like an overnight irrigation. That would be better. If you just went and sprayed it, it wouldn't do much. So you're looking for a soaking rain. And like I said, if you put this somewhere where water pools, or you sculpt the landscape by putting check bars in. If you know anything about Conservation Corps work, you can create an area where it pools and that has a chance to soak in without it being a violent torrential, runoff event that's, erodes the landscape.
Sure.
Yeah.
You kind of mentioned a few people are late to the party. What is the optimal time? It seems like for most, and I know there's different growing seasons in different parts of the country, but it seems like we're a little past prime maybe at this point for putting in a plot for this year.
No way.
Great.
No way. It's the best time ever. So basically, as long as the ground isn't frozen, it's a good time, especially if it's over 50 degrees, which is morel season in the spring or green up to about when the leaves fall off or begin to fall off in the autumn. That's your window of installation. It's a perennial food source. When's the best time to put an apple tree in? Yesterday. When's the second best time? Right now. You're not going to get any apples till you plant it. And same thing here. You got to, get it going. Generally speaking, it takes the shortest I've ever seen it, 70 days-ish. The fastest, these are days over 72 degrees, mind you, right? As an average. The longest that I've ever seen it take was 120 plus. The materials that we make it out of are largely what dictates that. If you use a denser hardwood like oak or a hardened maple, that's going to have more hemicellulose and just be denser. It's going to take longer to colonize, but it's also going to give you mushrooms longer on the backside. It's going to last longer, take longer to rot. If you use materials like aspen and softer maple or poplars, elm, things like that, softer hardwoods, birch, as your overtopping or your sawdust there, it's going to colonize faster and it's going to produce mushrooms faster, but it's also going to rot faster or peter out faster.
We've talked about this a little bit, but I think it's easy for people doing something new to get discouraged easily. So like say somebody walks out there in July when it's like 90 degrees and it doesn't look like anything has happened. Or maybe it's October and it's really unseasonably hot out. It hasn't rained in a while. Like you wouldn't expect there to be mushrooms at that point, right? Like you're expecting them to be more pop up after a rain or be the right temperature.
Maybe. What are the temperatures at night? What is the temperature in the shade versus in the sun? What is the aspect of that hill like? Is it a microclimate? Does the fog move and pool up in that area? There are a number of variables that can come into play with this and promote food greening. If you put it somewhere where there's a lot of moss, then you automatically know there's a lot of moisture in that area. And even though it may be dry, that moss doesn't look like nothing. It's still green. And so, where's the water table? Is it an inch below the surface, a foot below the surface, 10 feet below? These things all weigh into it. If I go out 1st of July and it's dry, well, that's normal. We get hot, dry periods followed by heavy rains, usually, not always. And that's what triggers all those wonderful mushrooms that we love, like chanterelles. And then when it's hot and dry between rain, you think, my goodness, and mushroom could never be out here. Yet there's millions of chanterelles less than an inch tall all around you that are just waiting for the next rain to grow another inch and then another inch. And before you know it, you have a basket full and you're singing the praises of the forest. So it's easy to discourage because we're so big and we're looking for something so minute. So if you're out there in July, you want to just kind of brush aside the sawdust and see the white mycelium growing and smell it. And that'll give you a pick-me-up. And then same thing in October when you get in there. Yeah, maybe it's hot and dry today, but did it rain 5 days ago, 10 days ago, a week ago? Is it going to in the next week? Is it going to be a 5-day soaker where the first few days begin the mushroom primordia formation? And then the second few 3-4 days or whatever afterwards are the perfect atmospheric conditions to make those mushrooms double or triple in size every day. And all of a sudden you have a feast in front of you that at the same time, that hot, dry conditions dried up all the forbs and the grasses and everything else that you were, depending on to hunt over. So embrace the suck. Look, you got to look at it through multiple lenses. You can't just walk in there and go, dang, no mushrooms. Well, get down on your hands and knees maybe and look a little harder. Look for a shrump. That's a little hump that looks like maybe there could be a mushroom hiding underneath there, right? These mushrooms are notorious for hiding just underneath the surface. And the deer are practically evolved with that long snout and their superhuman sense of smell to sniff them out from that set of circumstances. And arguably, mushrooms emit smell, i.e. volatile organic compounds, to attract wildlife. There are many fungi that are not the spores, which are haploid, require two to mate, are arguably designed to move through the scat and then become viable because they're together. If it's a mushroom just flying around, the chances of two of them meeting and mating that's obscene. Most mushrooms don't make it past the 3-foot mark with regards to wind or water moving them around the landscape. The spores don't, right? But with an animal that walks through and eats it, now those fungal spores can be distributed across vast areas, and that increases the biodiversity on the landscape.
One thing that you mentioned before when we talked was, I think you used clover as an example, overseeding clover in an area where you're doing this. So if you've got a little clearing, or like you do want to have a little something that attracts deer wildlife when the mushrooms are not necessarily popping or not available for forage, that's something that you can do as well.
Right. So it's more or less a compost pile, and growing anything in a compost pile tends to enrich the plant's quality. Compost grown tomatoes, for example, right? So if whatever that browse element is there, whether we're overseeding it or it's the natural stuff, I have millions of trout lilies coming up through mine right now because all those spring ephemerals are breaking through them, and the deer are destroying those trout lilies. They eat all the trout lilies, but there's nearly none left on the mushroom plot or around it, versus there's quite a few left in the areas of, a little bit further away. And that speaks to that elevated browse quality. And that ergothioneine that we talked about earlier and the ergosterol are present in that browse in elevated amounts. There would be a very tiny amount in them naturally, but because they're grown in those mushroom-rich areas, there's more. That's why we see browse lines in the wild around rotting wood that are heavier. The plants around rotting wood, and that's essentially what we're doing, is creating a whole tree that's chopped up and rotting, right? But the plants around that rotting wood have elevated quality because of the decomposition occurring there, i.e. compost, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I love overseeding it with anything I can. Most of the time, we're going in the shade with this. You can do it in full sun, but you've got to go really thick with the ingredients. And you need to plant over shade, like corn or something. And they can be intercrop. There are people that do that all over the world. Wheat and corn in particular are done with this mushroom in an intercropping fashion. And once again, no fertilizer, no lime. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to using your crop waste to grow this other crop that the deer will tear up, which means they won't eat your crop. And then you can take the compost from that trap crop and apply it to your other crop. Kind of a bunch of wind scattered there. Pretty good looking season, in my opinion. But we can do it on a micro plot in the forest. I like to do these on kind of east-west lines out in the woods and hot cold zones, so to speak. Or I like to put them across the landscape where they catch water, but they also get shade, maybe dappling of sun. This mushroom does like sun a little bit more than others. And so just inside the edge, right, where those deer want to stage anyway, give them something to do while they're standing there checking that plot. Here's a few bites of food to be distracted with while I stick you with an arrow. So it becomes about how you can use this tool for yourself as a hunter. But also, like I said, if you happen to be harvesting a mature whitetail buck and there's a whole bunch of side dishes right there next to him laying on the ground, oh my gosh, what luck. My son got his first little 5-pointer over one last year. If we weren't playing cards early in the morning, we would have noticed that the buck I was after walked through at 9 a.m. In the same exact spot. But that's just the way life goes.
Through your mushroom food plot.
Yep, right on the mushroom food plot. Yep.
That is wild. You mentioned per square foot or square acre, right, it produces a lot of tonnage, which if you talk to food plot guys, they're always thinking about how much tonnage can I get in a particular area. So can you speak to that with mushrooms, like maybe comparing it to some other common crops?
Yeah, well, there's no silver bullet. I mean, with mushrooms, there is some ephemeral faction there. You can use irrigation to make them nonstop, but if the ground's frozen, they're not in play. For us here in the UP, that's a big deal. But I was able to hunt over one last year with our freakish weather right up into rifle season and had great results, which is middle of November, which is astounding for us. I was planning on it only being a thing for early October archery. But that being said, let's say 4 pounds per square foot on a 4-year basis, right? So 16 pounds a square foot over the life of it. If you make it one time and never add any more sawdust or wood chips, anything ever again, which you should do every year or two at half the rate you additionally did it. So if you put down 1 yard before, you put a half yard down every year or two, just to kind of keep it going. Or you can throw a new straw bale on it a couple times a year. It's whatever you got, corn cobs, you name it. So if we do that per, sizes, the biggest package we offer covers 500 square foot. Well, it doesn't just produce mushrooms on that 500 square foot of applied coverage. It produces them 3 to 5, 8 feet around the edge. And so bearing that in mind, it's really like triple the square footage. And so, 500 times 3 is 1,500. 1,500 times 4 is 6,000 pounds off of a applied 500 square foot of coverage. Corn per acre is like 9,000. So that's huge. We didn't even lay down, that much square footage. The best Forbes, 3,000 pounds an acre. We just put down 2 acres worth of Forbes by applying 50 pounds of square or 10 bales of straw, 10 yards, and 50 pounds of spawn. That's pretty significant. And we did it in the shade. We didn't have to use any lime, any fertilizer, any herbicide. We didn't have to bring down a single tree. We don't have to maintain a canopy opening. I don't see the loss there. We can do it in pines where you can't grow anything else.
Yeah, you make mushroom food plots sound amazing.
Oh, they're so simple. A child could do this. This is probably the easiest habitat improvement to do other than a mock scrape, which some people even struggle with that. And don't use your wife's good garden rake to make a mock scrape with, guys. Okay. Get one of the all steel ones. It's really nice. You're going to work in the woods. You need tools made for working in the woods.
Yeah. And speaking of tools for making mushroom food plots, where can people find the spawn to get started here?
Well, Stropharia is one of the most commonly grown mushrooms in the world. And you can buy it at a whole bunch of places. I don't think many of them will be able to answer your technical questions about this subject, though. We sell it. This is the way you can enable me to do the work that I'm doing now as a forager who's relentlessly investigating this and as a citizen scientist. Unfortunately, we all have to do something for money. So I have to sell spawn to fund this addiction. So you can buy that from us at myco-habitat.com. You can go on Facebook and find us at Myco Habitat. You can call me. You can email me. You can send a pigeon, whatever, maybe Western Union. I have a lot of Amish customers that ride buggies in the town to call us on the phone. And whatever it is, I welcome it.
Awesome. And for everybody listening, that's Myco spelled MYCO, right, Matt?
Yeah, Latin for mushroom.
Awesome.
But there's a double entendre. I mean, it's my cohabitat too, because I live there. I cohabitate the space with them.
And with the deer.
Yeah.
One thing also that we haven't mentioned, apart from you talking about selling mushrooms to sell to people to eat, which is these are edible mushrooms for humans too. So it's like,
they're delicious.
If you like mushrooms, this is a thing you can go out and, harvest a little bit of.
A lot of it of, you got 100 pounds, you put up enough for a year in 1 week, you can pickle them, you can can them. They're thick, they're dense, they're meaty. You can saute them lightly and cook the moisture out and then vacuum seal and freeze them. They make a wonderful addition to venison.
The Outdoor Life podcast is edited by Mike Pedersen of 85 Audio. It's normally hosted by our editor-in-chief, Alex Robinson. It's produced by me, executive editor Natalie Krebs. You can hear more from Matt Williams by reading my full story about mushroom food plots at outdoorlife.com/mushroom plots. Music in this episode is by Pierre Locatelli via APM Music.